In the quiet Connecticut countryside during the 1970s, a respectable family was slowly being consumed by something they had invited into their home without knowing what it truly was. And by the time they understood the nature of their mistake, the thing attached to the cabinet in their living room had already spent 3 years shaping their dreams and feeding on the gradual erosion of their peace. The Crowell family were not the kind of people who believed in hauntings or thought much about the supernatural world beyond the comfortable boundaries of their Sunday church attendance and their practical daily routines rooted in community and tradition. Their home had stood for 2 generations, built by the grandfather's own hands and passed down through the family line with all the accumulated memories and ordinary history that such a place gathers over decades of births and deaths and the thousands small moments that fill the space between. Nothing in the house's history suggested anything unusual. No whispered stories of strange occurrences or uncomfortable nights. No reputation in the community as a place where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. What changed, what opened the door to what would follow, was something as ordinary as an estate sale on a Saturday afternoon, when the family decided they needed a new piece of furniture for the living room, and found themselves drawn to a large wooden cabinet with beautiful dark wood and intricate carvings that seemed like a bargain given its obvious quality and craftsmanship. The cabinet came home with them that weekend and was given a place of prominence in the main living room, where it could be admired by visitors and serve as a focal point for the space. Nobody knew where it had come from originally or who had owned it before the estate sale, and nobody thought to ask because it was just furniture, just a beautiful old piece that would look handsome in their home. The changes that followed were so gradual, so subtle in their initial manifestation, that the family almost managed to convince themselves that nothing was really wrong, that the discomfort they felt was just adjustment to a new arrangement of furniture or the play of shadows cast by the cabinet's considerable size in the evening light. The living room began to feel different in ways they could not quite articulate, a quality of the space that made family members choose other rooms to gather in when the sun went down, a vague reluctance that they rationalized as preference or coincidence rather than recognition of something genuinely wrong. The family cat, who had previously roamed freely throughout the house, refused categorically to enter the living room once the cabinet had been installed, and would sit at the threshold with her back arched if anyone tried to carry her across that boundary. Dreams throughout the household shifted in character, not dramatically enough to cause alarm, but persistently enough that everyone was sleeping less deeply, waking more frequently in the night, rising in the morning feeling less restored than they should have felt after a full night in bed. 3 years passed in this slow degradation before the phenomena became impossible to rationalize or ignore. The sounds began as faint movement from inside the cabinet, audible when the house was quiet, coming from within a piece of furniture that stood empty with its doors locked shut. Family members would pause in the hallway and listen, trying to convince themselves they were hearing the house settling or some innocent explanation. But the sounds persisted and grew more distinct over time. Knocking came next, clear deliberate raps from inside the cabinet that had no possible natural source, sounds that made the younger children cry and the adults exchange worried glances across the dinner table. Doors that had been latched carefully at night were found standing open in the morning, the cabinet gaping like a mouth waiting to be fed. Then came the sightings, first by the teenage daughter who woke one night and saw a dark form standing beside the cabinet in the living room, a shape that was present but wrong, a shadow that existed independent of any light source that could cast it. She said nothing for 2 weeks, until her younger brother mentioned at breakfast that he had seen something by the cabinet, and the description he gave matched hers so precisely that the family's wall of rationalization finally collapsed under the weight of what could no longer be denied. The Warrens came to the Crowell home on a gray afternoon with their equipment and their decades of experience, and their particular combination of Catholic faith and hard-won knowledge about how the demonic operates in the material world. Ed Warren carried himself with the steady authority of a man who had walked into hundreds of houses like this one and seen things that would have broken people with less faith or less determination, while Lorraine Warren moved through spaces with the sensitivity of someone whose psychic gifts made her vulnerable to impressions and presences that others could only detect through their effects. They were directed immediately to the living room where the cabinet stood, and Lorraine's reaction as she approached the piece told the family everything they needed to know about whether their fear was justified. She stopped several feet away from the cabinet and stood very still, her face tightening in concentration, and she remained in that position for several long minutes before she was willing to take another step closer. When she finally did touch the cabinet's surface, her hand moved slowly as if approaching something that might bite, and her impressions came out in careful measured words about darkness and suffering and spiritual compromise that had soaked into the wood grain over years or possibly decades of misuse. Ed Warren examined the cabinet with the methodical attention of an investigator who knew that details mattered, running his hands over the carvings and metalwork, pausing at certain symbols that meant nothing to the family but clearly meant something to him. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and sketched some of the markings, comparing them to reference notes he had accumulated over his years of demonological study, and when he looked up, his expression was grave. The symbols were not obvious, not the kind of occult imagery that would be recognized by someone without specialized knowledge, but they were present and they were purposeful, markers that indicated this piece of furniture had been prepared and used for ceremonial practice by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Lorraine's psychic impressions and Ed's physical evidence pointed to the same conclusion from different directions, meeting in the middle at a truth the Crowells had never imagined when they bought the cabinet at an estate sale. They had brought home an object that had been deliberately used as a focal point for inviting something into the world, and that something had remained attached to the wood and metal across all the years and all the owners between the original ceremony and the sunny Saturday when the Crowells had loaded it into their truck. Ed Warren explained to the family that what they were experiencing was an object-tankard infestation, a category of paranormal intrusion that he considered particularly insidious because of how it operated. Unlike a haunted location where the presence was tied to the land or the structure itself, an entity attached to a portable object could move freely into any environment where that object was placed, establishing itself in homes that had no prior history of phenomena and no inherent vulnerability beyond the simple fact of having given the contaminated object a place within their walls. The danger was amplified by the gradual nature of the intrusion, the patient way the entity had used its 3 years of access to degrade the family's spiritual equilibrium and establish itself deeply in the household's atmosphere. By the time the Crowells recognized they needed help, the thing attached to the cabinet had already reshaped their dream life, diminished their rest, and begun manifesting physically in ways that signaled its readiness to escalate. The good news, Warren told them, was that removing the object would remove the anchor, that they would not need the extended intervention required for a location-based haunting, because the entity's attachment was to the cabinet itself rather than to their home. The removal was conducted with all the ritual care that Ed Warren brought to such procedures, beginning with prayers and blessings spoken over the cabinet before it was touched, protective measures designed to prevent the entity from simply detaching and remaining in the house once its physical anchor was moved. The cabinet was carried out by men who had been briefed on the situation and who worked quickly and without conversation, loading the piece into a truck while a priest continued prayers throughout the process. The cabinet was not taken to the Warren Occult Museum, where the most significant possessed objects were stored for study and containment, but was instead transporting to a disposal site where Ed Warren had arranged for it to be destroyed completely. Fire was his preferred method for objects like this, objects that carried darkness but did not warrant preservation, and the burning was conducted with the priest in attendance offering prayers of expulsion as the flames consumed the wood and reduced the carefully carved symbols to ash. Lorraine Warren, present for the burning, reported that she could feel the moment when the entity's attachment was severed, a perceptible shift in the spiritual atmosphere as the physical anchor that had bound it to the material world was unmade. Back at the Crowell home, the same priest who had overseen the burning conducted a complete house blessing, moving systematically through every room with holy water and prayer, paying special attention to the living room where the cabinet had stood for 3 years. Lorraine monitored the cleansing with her particular sensitivity to spiritual atmospheres, and she told the family that the quality of the house was changing even as they worked, that the oppressive weight that had accumulated over the years of the cabinet's presence was lifting, and the space was returning to its natural character. The family reported that they could feel the difference immediately, that the living room no longer felt like a place to be avoided, that the subtle wrongness they had learned to live with had vanished so completely that its absence was almost startling. In the weeks that followed, their sleep returned to normal, the disturbing dreams ceased, and the family cat began entering the living room again without hesitation. The phenomena that had driven them to contact the Warrens never recurred, and the case was closed as a successful intervention against an object-based infestation. The Crowell case became part of the extensive documentation that Ed and Lorraine Warren accumulated over their decades of paranormal investigation, filed among hundreds of other Connecticut cases in the New England Society for Psychic Research Archives, as an example of how easily ordinary people could unknowingly introduce genuine spiritual danger into their homes. Ed Warren spoke often in his public lectures about the risks associated with antique objects from estate sales and auctions, explaining that while the vast majority of old furniture carried no paranormal significance whatsoever, the small percentage of objects that had been used in occult practice represented a real threat that most people had no way of identifying before the damage was done. He was careful not to make people paranoid about every old chair or table they might consider purchasing, but he wanted them to understand that provenance mattered, that an object's history could include spiritual contamination just as surely as it could include beauty and craftsmanship. The Crowells had learned this lesson in the hardest way possible, through 3 years of gradually escalating phenomena that had nearly normalized the presence of something dark in their family home. And their case stood as a warning about the patience of entities that knew how to work slowly enough that their victims might not recognize they were victims until the trap had already closed. Hashtags Paranormal Investigation Ed and Lorraine Warren, True Horror Story, Haunted Object, Demon Infestation, Connecticut Haunting, Vanishing Roads, Supernatural Stories, Real Ghost Stories, Warren Case Files, Cursed Antiques, Object Haunting, Paranormal Documentary, True Paranormal Spooky Stories. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented paranormal case files. All events reference real investigations by Ed and Lorraine Warren.